Prologue. Chance. John Ark was hungry. He was hungry, tired, and a myriad of other things as he trekked through the forests outside of Ansel. But despite the various ailments currently afflicting him, he chose to carry on. After all, he wanted to be a hero, and what kind of hero would let something as minor as an empty stomach stop him partway through his journey? Grumble. Obviously John's stomach didn't feel the same way. He sighed, regretting not raiding his family's pantry for more snacks before leaving. He had chosen to err on the side of stealth and caution as he slipped away in the early morning hours, not wanting to risk alerting his parents with too much noise. They already didn't think he was fit to be a huntsman, and they would have grounded him for eternity if they caught him stealing Crocea Morse as he snuck out to go join Beacon. Sure, they were probably right, as he might have had to forge his transcripts to get in, but darn it, he was dedicated to prove them wrong. It was now somewhere around noon, and John had been walking for several hours already. Normally the trip from Ansel to Vale would take a few hours by car on the highways that drove around Vale's various eastern mountains. Instead, he was walking a more direct path through what he was hoping was not Grimm-infested forests. Shorter the distance, but at a much slower pace. By the calculations he made the day before he left, he should reach Vale by sunset, where he'll go rent a nice, cheap motel, then fly to Beacon the next day by airship. Dust. He hoped he wouldn't puke on an airship again. The last time he rode on one was during a family camping trip to Anima, about 6 or 7 years ago. He's sure he must have outgrown his motion sickness by now. But that was neither here nor there. Right now he just had to keep putting one foot in front of the other. All he had to do was keep heading west and keep his chip up. Confident. He had to focus on all the things he was going to achieve. Not the fact that he might have lost track of west with the sun at high noon, the fact that he had no food, no reception on his scroll, and no dust and Grimm he was going to die out here. No. Can't think like that. No negative thoughts, no siree. Gotta stay positive, confident. 1 foot in front of the oath. Crack. The sound of a branch snapping echoed through the air. Begrudgingly, John looked down. There were no sticks or twigs beneath him. He didn't make that noise. Growl. John froze as he heard the guttural snarl from behind him. Slowly he turned, cranking his neck as far back as he could, and that's when he saw it out of the corner of his eye. A Beowulf, larger than any he'd seen in books, with several white bony spines protruding from its arms. Oh sugar honey iced tea, that's a big Grimm. John felt his heart sink. His knees became weak, his palms sweaty. He wanted to vomit out the leftover spaghetti he ate for breakfast. Okay John, think. How do you get out of this? Movement, right. A Grimm's vision is based on movement. At least that's what that one movie about a Grimm theme park said. And movies wouldn't lie, right? The 17-year-old boy stood completely still, save for the pounding of his heart. To his surprise, the Beowulf seemed to stop as well, tilting its head to side as if confused. However, John's relief then turned to sheer panic as the Beowulf instantaneously lunged forward, charging straight for John. To his credit, while John never actually had any combat training, he at least considered himself reasonably fit. Fit enough that he was able to turn, sprint, and keep a solid distance from the Grimm as he ran for his life. Curse you movies. Why would you lie to me? 5 minutes. John had been sprinting as fast as he possibly could for the last 5 minutes. His legs burned, lungs hurt, but his body ignored all of it as he was completely overtaken by his flight instincts. Taking a quick peek behind him, he saw that the Beowulf Alpha was still hot on his tail, rampaging through the forest for its next meal. John swore under his breath. He couldn't keep this up and he knew it. He was getting too tired, and if he didn't change strategies, he was going to die. Part of him thought about drawing Crocea Morse and trying to take down the Grimm, but its sheer size and apparent age shot down that idea quickly. While John wanted to be a hero, he was realistic enough to know when he was outmatched. He glanced around, looking for anything he could use to get the advantage. That's when he felt a pull to his left. Not a physical, grabbing pull, but something in the back of his mind telling him to look that direction. Deciding to trust this gut instinct, he turned toward the direction and saw a cave. Not a large, gaping hole in a mountain, but a small crack in the stone, tight enough for him to just barely fit while the Grimm would have no chance of entering. Seeing that was his best chance of survival, Jaune pivoted, dashing for the crag. The Beowulf dug its claws into the ground to redirect its momentum and keep pace with the more nimble human. "Ah, please stop being so smart," Jaune cried out as he beelined for the cave. Jaune pushed forward as the Grimm gained ground behind him. As the last of Jaune's energy left him, he dove into the crack, ignoring the cuts and scrapes he received as he shoved himself deeper and deeper in. He heard a terrifying crunch behind him as he saw the Beowulf had caught up and tried to force its way after him. It continued to slam its skull and claws against the stone, desperately trying to break the mountain open for its next meal. With a whimper, Jaune kept pushing further and further through the crevice. After several terrifying seconds, Jaune squeezed himself out of the fissure and found himself in a much larger cavern. The teenager let out a brief sigh of relief as he was no longer in danger of getting pinned by some rocks and starving to death. And the idea of cutting a limb off to escape like in that one movie 172 Hours really didn't appeal to him. Roars and slams against the stone drew his attention back to the entrance, but they sounded distant and muted enough that he believed he was safe. Catching his breath, Jaune allowed himself to relax. All he had to do was rest, wait until the Grimm lost interest, and he would crawl his way back through the crevice and continue on his journey to Beacon. A little bit of a rough start, he had to admit, but what kind of hero's journey wouldn't start off with a bit action and terror? Resting his back against the stone wall, Jaune reached into his pack and pulled out his canteen, greedily gulping down some water. Now safe, Jaune took the time to examine his surroundings. The cavern was relatively small, only 5, maybe 6 feet in diameter, with a tunnel on the far end that continued further underground. There were a few low-hanging stalactites, but luckily the red lighting of the cavern was bright enough in here he could see them and avoid bashing his head open. Jaune froze for the second time today. Having been so focused on not dying, he didn't seem to notice that the entire cavern had a red tinge to it, illuminated by an unknown source. Caves were not supposed to be red. Where did all this light come from anyway? Jaune was both annoyed that he no longer had the opportunity to build the torch he wanted, but also scared of unknown source of power. Curiosity taking the better side of caution, Jaune followed the light, pushing further into the cavern. It only took a short amount of time for Jaune to reach the end of the cave, as it was not very deep. At the end, he found the source of the strange light. It was a strongbox, not unlike ones he'd seen his dad use to store weapons, or those magazines he didn't want his mom to find. The strongbox itself had some kind of screen or something where the lock would normally be. The screen fizzled in and out, leaving the strongbox unlocked and continually giving off the red hue that tinted the cavern. The box itself was covered with moss and rust. Jaune surmised that this thing must have been here for a long time. Jaune knelt in front of the box, placing both hands on the lid. The more rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop and walk away, but the curious, adventurous side urged him onward. With a slight motion, Jaune pushed the lid upward, opening the strongbox. With a click followed by a depressurizing hiss, the lid slowly rose, revealing its contents. It was a mask. Simple in design, yet pristine in condition. The mask had the appearance of the top half of a human skull. Blood-red rectangles marked the areas above the eye sockets, and mask was bisected vertically by a metallic band. Jaune found the mask haunting, but beautiful in a way. The design was rather morbid, and the coloration reminded him a little too much of the Grimm, but something about it drew him in anyway. He wondered if this was supposed to be a Grimm mask, like the ones the White Fang used. That train of thought sent a wave of panic through him. Was this place some kind of White Fang safe house or cache? Jaune moved to close the container, ready to leave the mask behind. He did not want to get involved with a group of terrorists before his first day of school. Strangely enough, Jaune found himself unable to leave the mask to its fate. He looked deep into the eyes of the mask. He felt something deep inside. Deep inside, he knew it would be a waste to leave this mask here. He felt compelled to take it, like a voice in the back of his head telling him that he needed it. After all, looking at the condition the container, this place hadn't been visited in years, maybe decades. Whoever left this mask here obviously didn't need it anymore. So why shouldn't he take it? And if the mask really did turn out to be White Fang, then he would just turn it into the police. He would tell them where he found the mask, they'd investigate, and maybe catch some bad guys. That made complete sense. John felt pride welling up inside of him. Not even starting Beacon yet and he was already making plans to catch criminals. John knew that huntsmen needed to trust their guts, and his instincts told him that he should take it. So, John reached into the box and grabbed a hold of the mask. Almost immediately, John felt a jolt of electricity surge through him. John flinched and closed his eyes, thinking he had sprung some sort of strange trap. Like the ones he'd seen in those movies about the whip-wielding archaeologist that searched for ancient artifacts during the Great War. But instead, he felt nothing but a warm embrace. He opened his eyes, and found himself enveloped by a yellow-white glow. Unbeknownst to him, the mask had awakened John Ark's aura. "Whoa, trippy," was all John could say as he examined the glow of his palm, then the back of his hand, before the light receded. John thought that reaction was weird, but ultimately decided to ignore it. He could investigate what just happened later, when he wasn't in a spooky cave in the middle of a Grimm-infested forest. John took one last look at the mask, staring intensely into its eyes that despite being empty, drew him in deeper and deeper. John shook his head. He thought that his adrenaline must finally be wearing off as he started to feel woozy. Quickly, John opened up his traveling pack and threw the mask inside. Closing it up, he returned to the crevice where he entered the cavern. Listening carefully, John could no longer hear the Grimm outside. Realizing that it must have lost interest, John quietly moused his way through the crag once again. Soon enough he popped out of the fissure, once again able to breathe in the open air and take in the afternoon sun. John scanned the area around him, and saw no signs of the Grimm that was chasing him, nor of any others. Satisfied with the safety of his surroundings, John took a look at his scroll. He only lost about half an hour with this whole debacle. If he power walked instead of taking a leisurely pace, he should be able to make up for lost time relatively quickly. So with a nod, a smile, and a never-ending sense of optimism, John continued to make his way towards Beacon, having unknowingly become the newest owner of the Mask of Darth Nihilus. Chapter 1. Dreams. John Ark felt sick to his stomach. 6 years. He had 6 dust-damned years to get over his motion sickness, but no, apparently his body just wanted to say, "Fuck you John, you don't get to be happy. Come on John, just focus, you're almost there. Just act like you're one of those Mistralian monks. Peace, calm, tranquility. Peace, calm, trank HRRGK." John's internal mantra was interrupted by a wave of nausea. Both hands flew to his mouth in a vain attempt to keep the bile in. Luckily, the bullhead he had been riding neared its destination, Beacon's air docks. Gurgle. His stomach would not wait that long. Rising from his seat and sprinting for the rear of the bullhead, John shoved some random, attractive, busty blonde out of the way as vomit was literally spilling between his fingers. He could vaguely hear the cries of said girl as he ran for the nearest trash can and emptied his stomach. Not the best way to start off the day. John mentally groaned to himself. As the bullhead's loading ramp opened up to release its passengers, John Ark once again found himself shoving his way past random students to empty his guts. His stomach now empty, John relaxed as he placed both hands on sweet, solid ground. It was only the last dregs of his pride that stopped him from kissing the concrete then and there. Reaching into his bag, John pulled out his canteen and washed out his mouth, hoping to remove any aftertaste and smell. As he finished, a small explosion rocked the ground. John dove to the side with a very clumsy combat roll, thinking that they were under attack or something. Standing up, he scanned the surroundings, and instead of seeing some hostile force he saw a cloud of smoke rising from 2 girls. The first girl, laying on the ground, looked younger than him, with black dress with red trims that matched her hair and corset. Her most distinctive feature was the flowing crimson hood. The second was a beautiful, noble-looking woman, with a silver-white ponytail, and the most awe-striking pale blue-white dress trimmed with a snowflake pattern as mesmerizing as she was. The duo began arguing, probably over the explosion, which only ended when a raven-haired beauty interrupted them. The mysterious amber-eyed interloper seemed to say something to anger the white-haired snow angel as she then stormed off. The third woman left as well, leaving the Red Riding Hood alone on the ground, dejected. John felt a pang of sympathy in his heart. The girl reminded him of one of his younger sisters, Amber. The girl would always lie down on the ground when their parents wouldn't give her something she wanted, usually cookies. John would always make sure to smuggle her some after her tantrum. Big brother instincts taking control, John sauntered up to the younger huntress. Shouldn't be hard to talk to her. He just needed to be confident. John stood over the girl, his shadow covering her face and getting her attention. Extending his hand, John tried to think of something cool to say, but only blurted out, "Hey. I'm John." Red Riding Hood took his hand and politely responded, "Ruby." As she pulled herself off the ground. "Hey, aren't you that guy who threw up on the ship?" John let out a very unmanly groan. "All I'm saying is that motion sickness is a much more common problem than people let on." John tried to defend himself as he and Ruby walked through one of Beacon Academy's several gardens. Ruby failed to stifle a laugh. "Look, I'm sorry. Vomit Boy was the first thing that came to mind." Indignantly, John crossed his arms. It was time to go on the offensive. "Oh, yeah. What if I called you Crater Face?" That seemed to strike a nerve with Crater Face. "Hey, that explosion was an accident." "Well, the name's John Ark. Short, sweet, rolls off the tongue. Ladies love it." John had practiced that line in the mirror at least a dozen times. He was sure he got the delivery right. Ruby raised an incredulous eyebrow. "Did they?" John's playboy facade instantly broke down. "They will. Well, I hope they will. My mom always says that." "Never mind." John mentally kicked himself. Who brings up their mother in their first conversation with a girl? The silence was pregnant with twins, so Ruby decided to open up another topic of conversation. "So, I got this thing." The little Red Reaper pulled out a massive weapon, a crimson mecha ship scythe that John had no idea how he missed. "Whoa. Is that a scythe?" John cried out. "It's also a customizable high-impact sniper rifle." Ruby glowed with pride. "Aww. It's also a gun," Ruby explained, smirking as she cocked her baby. "Oh. That's cool." John actually thought so. He'd never actually seen a weapon like that before. All of the weapons in his family's home were regular weapons, he supposed. Axes, halberds, swords, that kind of stuff. "So what have you got?" Ruby asked, trying her best to contain her lust for weaponry. "Oh. I got this sword," John proclaimed as he drew Crocea Morse. "Ooh. Yeah, and I've got a shield too." John plucked the scabbard off his belt, planting it onto his arm and expanded the shield. "So, what do they do?" "The shield gets smaller, so when I get tired of carrying it, I can just put it away." "But wouldn't it just weigh the same?" Ruby was confused to say the least. "Yeah, it does." John let his arms fall to the ground, dejected. "Well, I'm kind of a dork when it comes to weapons, Sue. I guess I did go a little overboard when designing it." Ruby timidly rubbed the back of her head. "Wait, you made that?" "Of course. All students at Signal forge their own weapons. Didn't you make yours?" "It's a hand-me-down. My great-great-grandfather used it to fight in the war." The weight of that fact never really hit John until he just stated it. He could feel the amount of bloodshed this blade wrought, hear the terror in the cries of its victims. Wait, what? John had no idea where such dark thoughts came from. Though thinking about it, John felt as though he should give his ancestral blade more reverence. Calling it a hand-me-down seemed insulting to the spirits of those slain by it. "Sounds more like a family heirloom to me." Ruby laughed, trying to bring the spirits of her new friend up. "Well, I like it. Not many people have an appreciation for the classics these days." John sheathed his sword, a little unsettled. "Yeah, the classics." As the duo picked up the pace once again, Ruby couldn't help but feel her curiosity get the better of her. "So, why'd you help me out back there? In the courtyard?" John just shrugged. "Hey, why not? My mom always says, strangers are just friends you haven't met yet." John cursed in his head as he realized he brought up his mom again. Luckily Ruby didn't seem to notice. Ruby stopped, and realized she had no idea where they were. Hey, where are we going? Oh, I don't know. I was following you. John thought that this beginning sounded about right with his luck. After unintentionally touring around campus, Ruby and John finally found the auditorium. The blonde that John bumped into previously seemed to recognize Ruby and called out to her. Ruby, over here. I saved you a spot. The yellow one yelled over the crowd. Oh. Hey, I gotta go. I'll see you after the ceremony. Ruby quickly spoke before abandoning John. Ah, great. Where am I supposed to find another nice, quirky girl to talk to? John couldn't help but feel like he was being watched as he complained and despondently walked over to the back of the auditorium. John felt the full force of both being alone and too awkward to strike up a conversation with someone new as he stood by himself within the crowd. Instinctively, John turned and looked back at Ruby's group, as he heard voices being raised in that direction. The snow angel from earlier had appeared once again, and seemed to be talking about him. He heard something about blonde hair and she pointed at him. Obviously she must have been stricken by his dashing good looks and natural charisma. John was going to walk over and break the ice when he was interrupted by a figure walking out on stage. An older man, John assumed one of the professors, with silver gray hair and a cane stood in front of a microphone next to a woman that both terrified and excited John in equal parts. Even from this distance, John could feel power radiating off this man. It made him feel wary. This man would have to be watched, kept at a distance. He could be a possible threat. John shook his head, clearing that strange train of thought out of his mind. He didn't even know this man. Why would he be a threat? Oh, maybe it's that hunter's instinct he's heard about finally coming into maturity. Where seasoned huntsmen and huntresses are able to identify and assess dangers just from a glance. Oh, having a skill like that would be so cool. The man cleared his throat and spoke. I'll keep this brief. You have traveled here today in search of knowledge, to hone your craft and acquire new skills, and when you have finished, you plan to dedicate your life to the protection of the people. But I look amongst you, and all I see is wasted energy, in need of purpose, direction. The students began whispering amongst themselves at the uplifting speech. You assume knowledge will free you of this, but your time at this school will prove that knowledge can only carry you so far. It is up to you to take the first step. The man then simply turned and walked away. As the man left, his blonde assistant stepped forward. You will gather in the ballroom tonight. Tomorrow, your initiation begins. Be ready. You are dismissed. The trio of girls continued to talk as the professors left, and John thought it was the perfect time to introduce himself. Moving in from behind, John slickly slid up behind Snow Angel and said, I'm a natural blonde, you know. Snow Angel face palmed. Later that night, John found himself nestled in the ballroom between two overly hormonal male teenagers that decided to display their superiority by flexing shirtless. He didn't need any of that, because he would be sleeping in comfort and style as he threw on his favorite onesie pajamas. He saw Young, who he now knew as Ruby's older sister, look over, so he gave her a friendly wave. She seemed to groan and look away. She must still be upset about the shoes. Well, he'll just give her some space and hopefully that'll all be water under the bridge. John nuzzled up under his sleeping bag and quickly let sleep embrace him. John awakened to the sensation of wind on his face and the sun beating upon his closed eyes, neither of which made sense since he was sleeping indoors in the ballroom. John moved his hand to reach for his blanket to throw over his face, but found himself only grabbing a handful of grass instead. That woke John right up. Shooting up, John looked around to see just where in the name of Grimm he was. All around him, he saw amber waves of tall grass. It was a plain with rolling hills that he'd never seen before. A plain that he shouldn't be in because he should be in Beacon's ballroom. How in the name of the brothers did he get here? Tell me, unintelligible, what do you think of the plains of Dantooine? A voice called out behind John. John immediately spun around towards the source. The speaker was a man. An exceedingly tall man that easily towered over John. He wore a form-fitting black uniform that had orange bracers, boots, and pauldrons layered over it. His torso had a strip of orange fabric that extended down into a long loincloth. He had a stern face and strong jaw, with a shaved bald head that had two blue squares tattooed onto it. Goddamn. John sputtered out. Where the Grimm is that? Why am I here? The man only seemed to ignore John as he walked right past him. Hey! Don't ignore me! John cried out and he tried to put his hand on the man's shoulder to stop him. To John's shock, his hand only seemed to pass through the man, as if he were made of smoke. Wah! Was the only word John's overloaded mind could muster. It is peaceful. Another voice called out, deeper and raspier than the first. John looked, and as if appearing out of nowhere, another figure sat upon the nearby hill, eyes closed, meditating. The newest speaker was a dark-skinned human, with long black hair tied into a series of dreadlocks. His clothes were simple, long flowing robes of dark brown with no design or ornamentation. But sometimes, it's too peaceful. The man spoke again, before opening his eyes and looking to the first speaker. Isn't that why you sought me out, Alec? The now identified Alec smiled. Indeed. I was hoping you would honor me with a duel. We must not let our martial skills dull while on this world. The dreadlocked figure rose from his spot, and out of his sleeve, a metal cylindrical tube appeared. With a nod, Alec drew a similar pipe from his own belt. Both duelists pressed a button on their handles, and to John's shock, blades of pure energy apparated. Laser swords. Oh man, Ruby would be freaking out if she was here. John exclaimed as he backpedaled a few feet away from the upcoming fight. The two figures stared each other down for but a brief moment before the first move was made. Alec dashed towards the dreadlocked figure and swiped with a horizontal slash. The man easily parried him, deflecting the sword before releasing a quick flurry of counterattacks. The cuts were fast and aimed at Alec's limbs. The figure was aiming to debilitate Alec. Alec was forced to backpedal, deflecting the oncoming attacks, but the dreadlocked man kept pressuring him, increasing the speed. Seeing this exchange as lost, Alec instead retreated with a leap that John didn't think was possible. Chasing his prey, the dreadlocked figure leapt 30 feet in a single bound, simultaneously bringing his sword down on Alec's head. To stop this, Alec extended his offhand, and suddenly his opponent was blasted backwards by an unseen force. Tumbling into a backflip, the dreadlocked figure landed on both feet, staring Alec down once again. Both fighters decided to change strategy with the pause in battle. Both of them took a new stance, raising their swords high above them with both hands. With a twirl, they both charged once again. The strikes were now completely different. Instead of light, precise jabs and cuts, these attacks were heavy, powerful, and wide. John could feel the weight behind each attack, and it looked as if both fighters' laser swords threatened to fly out of their hands with each exchange. Parrying a slash, Alec was able to shift his opponent's momentum to his side, leaving him open for a full contact punch to the jaw. The strike connected, the power of it causing the dreadlocked figure to turn and stumble. However, the man would not go down quietly, and used the momentum of the turn to move into a spinning back kick, slamming right into Alec's gut. If John didn't know any better, he would have thought he was watching a choreographed performance rather than a fight. Each attack was beautiful and graceful, and neither fighter had actually landed a blade strike yet, as each attack would be expertly blocked and parried. Then Alec went for a low sweeping cut to the legs. His opponent reacted by doing an aerial flip over the blade. Landing behind Alec, the figure struck him in the spine with his knee, before pushing him forward with that unseen force John saw before. Alec stumbled forward, falling to one knee. John nearly called out as Alec's opponent went to strike him from behind, but Alec seemed to sense this coming. At the last second, Alec turned and blocked his opponent's leaping strike. As their blades locked, Alec glanced to his side and saw several small rocks. Alec's eyes seemed to glaze over, as the rocks began to levitate and fling themselves towards the dreadlocked figure. Several of the rocks pelted him, and forced the figure to retreat once again. Alec smiled as that exchange ended in his favor. The smile faded when he watched his opponent deactivate his lightsaber, and instead extend both palms outward. Alec's eyes widened at this, as he then mirrored the same motion. At first John was confused. The two fighters seemed to be like mimes, pushing forward with both hands, struggling against an invisible wall. That's when John saw it. Like a fallen rock that sent ripples through a still lake, the grass around them pulsed outwards as telekinetic energy overflowed from them. John watched the tall grass bend over, struggling to get away from the contest of wills. Both fighters struggled as sweat dripped down their brows. Every painful step they took towards the other seemed to cause the ground to shake. John thought they were going to destroy the entire landscape until a voice cut through the air. Enough! The voice shouted, commanding and authoritative. Alec and the dreadlocked figure both stopped, dropping their arms as they and John all looked to the newest arrival. This figure wore full brown robes, his face fully obscured by a hood. Alec was the first to bow to the man. Revan. He spoke reverently. Alec, unintelligible. This Revan spoke, his voice now much calmer. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, I would prefer it if you didn't destroy the countryside with your duel. Of course, our mistake. Alec apologized. Yes, we were merely attempting to pass the time as we wait for the council, nothing more. The dreadlocked figure added on. Revan gave a non-committal nod before turning around. Well, your wait is now over. Come. The council will see us now to hear our petition. With luck, they have seen reason and will choose to intervene in this senseless war. As the three figures walked away, John's vision began to blur and darken, until he was completely overtaken by darkness. Once again, John shot out of his dream state, this time back in Beacon's ballroom. He was panting hard, and looking down, he saw he sweat through his favorite onesie. John let out an annoyed sigh as he got out of his sleeping bag. As he disrobed, his mind was racing at 1,000 miles per hour. He'd never heard of a place called Dantooine in any of his classes. And who were those figures he saw? How could they do all of those crazy moves? All of that seemed surreal for some reason. Coming to Beacon must have really scrambled his brains to have a dream so vivid and imaginative. Folding his onesie up, John opened up his traveling pack to put it away. Looking into the pack, he paused as he saw the mask he found in the forest, laid out at the bottom of the bag, staring back up at him. I should probably store this thing in my locker in case anyone goes through my stuff. Was all John thought as he layered his onesie over the mask and went on to begin his next day at Beacon. Chapter 2. Initiation. Ridiculous. John cried out as he passed through Beacon's locker room, lost despite the map in his hands. There's no way I put my gear in locker 636 yesterday. I would have remembered having to count that high. Why does this have to happen today? A confused John continued to walk through the maze of lockers, passing by his new friend Ruby and her sister Yom, as well as a pink-haired manic girl talking a million miles per hour in her green-suited victim. Soon enough, John found his locker, and would you look at that, his snow angel Weiss and a new red-haired vixen were standing in front of it talking. John smiled. Obviously the fates were looking down on him today. So, Pyrrha, have you given any thought to whose team you'd like to be on? I'm sure everyone must be eager to unite with such a strong, well-known individual such as yourself. Weiss complimented. She was obviously trying to butter Pyrrha up, a fact that was not missed by the red-headed huntress but completely missed by the blonde dork of a knight. I'm not quite sure. I was planning on letting the chips fall where they may. Pyrrha responded in a practiced, neutral tone. Polite, but vague enough to not give an actual answer. Well, I was thinking maybe we could be on a team together. Weiss pressed, not wanting this opportunity to fail due to miscommunication. Pyrrha winced and looked to the side. She did not want to say no and potentially hurt Weiss's feelings, but she didn't want to be on her team even more. Well, that sounds grand. She forced out behind a fake smile. Weiss was elated. Great. She then seemed to fall into some kind of internal monologue, creating a lull in the conversation that allowed John to very casually interrupt. Sliding between them, John put his playboy face on once again. You know what else is great? Me. John Ark. Nice to meet you. You again. Weiss hurriedly said. John jumped on the inside. She's excited to see me. He thought as he completely misread her enunciation and body language. Pyrrha, thankful for the interruption, moved to speak to John and hopefully get out of her previous conversation. Nice to meet you, John. Dang it, Red, you're messing up my mojo right now. John thought as he was rudely interrupted. Yeah, He brushed Pyrrha aside as he focused in on Weiss, puffing his chest out. So, Weiss, couldn't help but overhear your fondness of me the other day. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Weiss exasperated, palming her face. Ah, that's so cute, she's embarrassed I heard. Jaune once again misread. Don't worry. No need to be embarrassed. He tried to assuage her. So, been hearing rumors about teams. I was thinking you and me would make a good one. What do you say? Pyrrha once again rudely interrupted his flirtations with Weiss. Actually, I think the teams are comprised of 4 students each so. That's when Jaune understood. She kept interrupting because she wanted his attention. Oh sweet merciful dust, only the second day here and women are already throwing themselves at him. As such, Jaune decided to lay it on thick for his newest potential partner. You don't say. Well, hot stuff, play your cards right and maybe you could join up with the winning team. Jaune confidently offered, stepping forward into Pyrrha's personal space. Weiss was not about to let this blonde doofus harass Pyrrha, so she stepped in to separate them. Jaune, is it? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Jaune leaned in closer. Not in the slightest, Snow Angel. Weiss let that comment slide in order to get her point across. This, she emphasized, is Pyrrha. Hello again. Pyrrha greeted with a wave. Pyrrha graduated top of her class at Sanctum. Weiss explained, hoping to dissuade Jaune with that fact. Never heard of it. He simply replied, blind to the scorn. Weiss scoffed. She's won the Mistral Region tournament 4 years in a row. A new record. The what? Jaune was now officially confused. Weiss flailed her arms in anger, drawing on something he'd know about Pyrrha. She's on the front of every Pumpkin Pete's Marshmallow Flakes box. Jaune gasped with the sudden realization. That's you. Jaune could now visualize a cereal box behind Pyrrha. But they only do that for star athletes and cartoon characters. Pyrrha was suddenly embarrassed by the sudden attention drawn to her fame. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Sadly, the cereal isn't very good for you. Now that he had an idea for how important Pyrrha was, Weiss went on the attack. So, after hearing all of this, do you really think you're in a position to ask her to be on your team? Jaune, finally realizing his inadequacies in comparison, hung his head in shame. I guess not. Sorry. Pyrrha, who was internally overjoyed by having found someone who didn't know her, stepped up to make Jaune feel better. Actually, Jaune, I think you'd make a great leader. Practically swooning, Jaune brightened back up. No, stop it. Weiss flatly as ever said. Seriously, please stop it. This kind of behavior should not be encouraged. Confidence renewed, Jaune stepped up to Weiss. Sounds like Pyrrha's on board for Team Jaune. Spots are filling up quick. Now, I'm not supposed to do this, but maybe I could pull some strings, find a place for you. What do you say? Weiss was now actually getting creeped out by how forward and close Jaune was getting. Alright, that's a bit too close. Pyrrha, a little help please. Jaune suddenly felt himself get thrown backwards as a javelin pierced his hood and pinned him to a locker, all while Pyrrha cried out, I'm sorry. Just then, Professor Goodwich's voice rang out over the intercom. Would all first-year students please report to Beacon Cliff for initiation? Again, all first-year students report to Beacon Cliff immediately. Weiss and Pyrrha made their way past Jaune, the former giving a small huff, while Pyrrha withdrew her spear from Jaune's hood. It was nice meeting you, Pyrrha weakly said as she left with Weiss. Likewise, Jaune groaned out as he further slumped against the locker. Before Jaune could stew in his emotions any longer, Young and RWBY came to his rescue. RWBY offered up a hand to Jaune, which he graciously accepted. Having some trouble there, Ladykiller. Young joked as Jaune pulled himself up. I don't understand. My dad said all women look for is confidence. Where did I go wrong? Jaune exclaimed. Snow Angel, probably wasn't the best start. Young explained as she gave him a pat on the shoulder. Come on, Jaune, let's go. RWBY led Jaune out of the locker room, supporting his damaged body and spirit. Soon enough, Jaune found himself standing upon Beacon Cliff, overlooking the Emerald Forest, standing on some strange silver platform along with many other potential students. Standing in front of all of them, was the ever-coffee-drinking, mug-holding Professor Ozpin, and his assistant Professor Goodwitch, looking over a tablet. For years, you have trained to become warriors, and today, your abilities will be evaluated in the Emerald Forest. Ozpin began as John nervously adjusted his collar. Glinda now spoke up. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard rumors about the assignment of teams. Well, allow us to put an end to your confusion. Each of you will be given teammates. Today. These teammates will be with you for the rest of your time here at Beacon. So it is in your best interest to be paired with someone with whom you can work well. Ozpin explained. John heard Ruby groan in the background. That being said, the first person you make eye contact with after landing will be your partner for the next 4 years. Ozpin finished. Ruby's cry of, "What?" could be heard over the whole crowd while the pink girl followed up with a, "See? I told you." After you've partnered up, make your way to the northern end of the forest. You will meet opposition along the way. Do not hesitate to destroy everything in your path. Or you will die. Ozpin's warning shot a wave of concern through the students. This was it, the real deal. No more safety nets. Do or die. John was nervous, gulping loudly. Save for that one Grimm that attacked him on the way here, he'd never been in any combat situation like this. Part of him considered just walking away, then and there. But he stayed. He made a choice to become a hero, and he was not going to back out now. You will be monitored and graded through the duration of your initiation, but our instructors will not intervene. You will find an abandoned temple at the end of the path containing several relics. Each pair must choose one and return to the top of the cliff. We will regard that item, as well as your standing, and grade you appropriately. Are there any questions? Ozpin finished. John raised his hand. Yeah, sir. Good. Now, take your position. Ozpin ignored the blonde. Everyone around him drew their weapons, standing in some sort of combat stance. John, still raising his hand, moved to get Ozpin's attention. Sir. I've got a question. So this landing strategy thing, what is it? You're, like, dropping us off or something? John nervously asked, ignoring the students behind him getting flung into the forest. No. You will be falling. Oh, I see. So like, did you hand out parachutes for us? John did not like the way this conversation was going. He has a really bad feeling about this whole thing. No. You will be using your own landing strategy. Yay. John, so focused on the headmaster, continued to miss students getting launched from the platforms. So, what exactly is a landing strategy? Why? John cried out as his platform hurled him into the blue sky, starting his initiation. John could only cry out as he tumbled through the air. John had no idea where he was flying, how to straighten himself, or how he was going to survive this in general. He was going to die, he knew it. Everything he did to get here was for nothing, all just to wind up as a red stain somewhere in the forest. He'd never see his family again, he'd never get the chance to finally get a girlfriend, he'd never become the hero he wanted to be. Fear gripped his heart. And from fear, comes anger. From anger, power. Kira held a Ko out in front of her, protecting herself as she slammed through tree after tree to slow her descent. Her momentum slowed enough, Kira landed on a branch and immediately drew Milo, looking through the scope of her rifle for her target. And there he was, the scraggly dork of a blonde named John Arc. While she may have told Weiss that she would let the chips fall where they may, Kira had learned long ago that one had to make their own luck. And having finally found someone who did not know who she was, that treated her like a normal person, she was not going to let him get away. So as John flew through the air, Kira readied Milo, preparing to throw it and spear John's hood like she did just prior in the locker room. But before she could make the throw, something happened. John, helplessly flying through the air, extended both hands in front of him. He screamed a cry of fear, anger, and desperation, and that's when it happened. Something came out of his hands. It was like an impulse, an invisible force. She did not know what it was, but it was not only powerful enough that she could feel the aftershocks where she was, but powerful enough to both slow John's descent and destroy part of the terrain beneath him. The unseen explosion ripped trees from the ground, stripping them of their leaves, and sent a cloud of dust into the air, all while slowly bringing Jaune onto the ground. Pyrrha was agape. Never before had she seen such a display of raw power. Never before had she so completely misread someone. From their previously interaction, she saw Jaune a funny, nice guy, but didn't give off much of an aura in terms of being a fighter. Pyrrha shook her head. Now was not the time to think about that. Such a display of a semblance would have surely drained Jaune of his aura. So with a change of strategy, Pyrrha dashed off of her perch and made her way for Jaune's position. Jaune was on his hands and knees hyperventilating, his everything was shaking. He didn't even have the strength to curl his fingers into a fist. What the dust was that? Jaune mentally screamed. I'm alive. Oh, thank the brothers I'm alive, but what was that? Jaune's mind was no longer able to process what was going on. This had probably been the most intense and insane minute of his life, and he just needed a minute to let his adrenaline drop and take everything in. A minute to absorb the fact that not only did he just almost die, but something just happened to make him not dead. He was so caught up in his own thoughts that he did not seem to notice the Beowulf creeping up behind him, attracted by the noise in his panicked state. The Grimm made its way behind the distracted knight, and raised one powerful claw up, ready to strike down its prey. Jaune was snapped out of his torpor by a loud bang as a familiar red and gold javelin flew past him. Jaune screamed and scrambled out of the way, turning to see an impaled Beowulf pinned to a tree. Standing up on weakened legs, barely able to support him, Jaune then heard a voice call out to him. Jaune! Pyrrha cried out, rushing to his position as she recalled her weapon to her. Are you all right? Pyrrha. Jaune responded, finally getting his bearings as the redhead entered the scene. Yeah, just a little shaken, not stirred, haha. Jaune tried to bring back some levity, but the joke sounded weak even to him. Pyrrha scowled. Jaune, are you okay? She asked, her voice more serious. Jaune sighed before nodding his head. Yeah, I think I'm good. Just needed to process what just happened. Thanks for the save though. Jaune meant it. If Pyrrha hadn't shown up when she did, he'd rather not think of the alternative. It's nothing. I'm sure you would have done the same for me. Pyrrha replied with a smile, before looking at the devastation around her. But still, you must have a very powerful semblance to do all of this. She gestured to the broken trees around them. A what? Was all Jaune had to say to that. A semblance, Jaune. Gesundheit. That made Pyrrha smirk a bit. Jaune, you don't know what a semblance is, do you? What about aura? Jaune, wanting to save at least some face, lied through his teeth, avoiding eye contact and waving off the question. PSSH. Of course I do. Do you know what they are? Pyrrha smiled again. Aura is the manifestation of our soul. It bears our burdens and shields our hearts. Have you ever felt you were being watched without knowing someone was there? Jaune felt like that was happening a lot more recently. Yeah, I have. With practice, our aura can be our shield. By bearing your soul outward as a force, you can deflect harm. All of our tools and equipment are conduits for aura. You protect yourself and your soul when fighting. So this aura, is it kinda like some sorta glow you get around you? He asked. Pyrrha nodded. Indeed, such a light does appear, typically when unlocking your aura, or when you project it. Pyrrha projected her own, enveloping her in a dark, crimson-red aura. So that's what it was. Jaune practically screamed out, causing Pyrrha to tilt her head in confusion. Jaune decided to explain his outburst. See, when I was on the way here, I was attacked by a Beowulf. And not just any Beowulf, but the mother of all alphas. And then Jaune paused, to think upon what he was about to say. And then when I was running, I hid, and my body just started glowing like that. Jaune thought about mentioning the mask, but he and Pyrrha just met. It didn't really seem necessary to share that information with her, at least not yet. Pyrrha seemed to think on this for a second before giving her opinion. Yes, that does sound like you unlocked your aura. Typically, you would have another person unlock your aura for you, but I have heard about how high-stress situations can force you to unlock your aura on your own. Stories of mothers unlocking their auras to lift cars off their children are the archetypal example of that. Meanwhile, a semblance is more of a projection of our aura into a more tangible form. This usually comes in the form of some sort of power. For example, Kira paused to levitate her sword with her semblance. My semblance is polarity, the ability to manipulate magnetism. Each person's semblance is unique, and can be trained and focused as well. John let out a bewildered "oh. And that's what you think I did here?" John responded, gesturing the destruction as well. "Indeed. I believe that you must have some sort of powerful, telekinetic semblance," she surmised. "Teleki what?" "Hey, telekinesis, John. The ability to move things with your mind. I know Professor Goodwitch has a similar semblance, or it could be considered a more robust form of what I do, as I can only move metal with my mind." Kira released her magnetic hold on her weapon and gripped it once again. "Ah, I get it." John didn't get it, but he understood enough that he was finally getting some answers. The white-yellow glow in the cave was his aura, and that massive energy wave he made was his semblance. Their talk was then interrupted by the sounds of gunfire echoing throughout the forest. "Did you hear that?" John asked, once again a bit nervous. "Gunfire," Kira stated as she readied her own weapons. "It seems some of our comrades have encountered the enemy. We should get ready to move, John. After all, we do still have an initiation to complete." John smiled, drawing Crocia Morse. "All right, let's get going, partner." John felt like he had to ask. Kira nodded and smiled in return. "Partner." And so the two huntsmen in training began to make their way north. Soon enough, Kira and John found themselves outside the mouth of a cave. On its side were paintings of men fighting against a giant armored scorpion. "Think this is it?" John asked his partner. Kira brought her fingers to her chin and thought. I'm not sure it is, but we could always go inside and check." John thought on this, staring into the darkness of the cave. Something about the cave made his stomach uneasy, and not in the way the airship did. "I don't know pyr. This. I've got a bad feeling about this place." John shook his head. He knew he sounded paranoid, but he really didn't like this cave. Kira put a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's avoid it. If we keep heading north, we may be able to find evidence of where we're supposed to go." John nodded, and quickly the two retreated from the cavern entrance and continued on north. Unbeknownst to them, shortly after the duo left, two new figures approached the cave's entrance. "Ah, a cave. What do you think, Rennie? Do you think there's a secret treasure inside? Maybe the lost artifact of a mysterious, sinister intergalactic cult?" Nora, the pink-haired bomber, asked her partner. Ren only sighed at both his nickname and his partner's example. "No, Nora, I doubt there's any treasure inside, intergalactic or not." "Well, there's only one way to find out." "Tally ho!" Nora cried out as she drew Monhild and charged into the cavern. "Nora! Wait!" Ren called in vain as he lost sight of Nora within the cave. Ren could only sigh again as he followed his childhood friend into the unknown. Eventually, both Kira and John found their way to the northern ruins. Currently standing there, John could barely make out the figure of Yang, along with the black-haired, amber-eyed girl he saw help RWBY yesterday. "Hey Yang!" John called out as he and Kira made their way over the final stretch of land. Yang turned to their direction, and gave a big smile and waved back. "Hey John! You guys made it." "Yeah, wasn't too hard to find this place," John said as the four students now stood together. "Oh, by the way, this is Kira, my partner." "Hello there." Kira gave a small wave to the Bumblebee duo. "Hey, nice to meet you." Yang greeted back. "I'm Yang, and this is my partner Blake." Blake, however, didn't respond, but instead seemed to be focused on something in the sky. "Blake, come on, don't be rude, say hi." Yang tried to get her introverted partner's attention. "Heads you up." A high-pitched voice all too familiar to Yang called from above as her sister RWBY was currently falling towards the ground. "RWBY!" Yang and John both cried out at once. Yang cocked Ember Celica, ready to launch herself upwards to save her sister. But before she could launch herself up, RWBY's descent began to slow down. "Wah!" was all Yang got out before she heard Kira call out John's name. Turning to her fellow blonde, she saw John had one of his hands extended in a look of pure, focused determination. As he slowly lowered his hand, Ruby was slowly dropped lower and lower, until she eventually plopped onto the ground, ungracefully landing on her butt. Ow my tush. Ruby mumbled out as Yang ran up and hugged her. Ow hey, Yang, I'm fine. Yeah you better be, Yang said, ruffling her hair. What happened? Ruby asked, confused by the landing strategy placed upon her. I think Vomit Boy over there saved your butt. Yang pointed a thumb over at John, who had his hands on his knees, exhausted from the telekinetic display. John. Ruby rushed up to him and Pyrrha, you saved me. Oh was that your semblance? John wheezed. Wheeze, yeah. Apparently I'm a telekinetic. Telekinetic, John. Pyrrha quickly corrected. Yeah, that. Wait Ruby, why did you just fall out of the sky? Blake cut in. As a matter of fact, where's your partner? Before Ruby could answer, several crashing noises were heard coming from the forest. Riding on the back of a giant deathstalker, Nora was currently having the time of her life. Yee-haw! She cried out as she drove the deathstalker forward, while her partner Ren was currently holding onto its tail for dear life. With a quick flick of its tail, the deathstalker flung Ren towards the rest of the teenagers, causing Nora to hit it with a quick grenade, stunning it so she could chase after her friend. Ren groaned as Pyrrha helped him up. Nora, don't ever do that again. Please. Ren looked for his partner, but she was already within the ruins, picking up a golden rook singing, I'm queen of the castle. Did they just ride in on a deathstalker? Blake asked, not believing what she was seeing. Yang had no words. Weiss. She then heard Ruby call out. Turning, the group could all see Weiss, hanging of the talon of a massive Nevermore flying above them. How could you leave me? Weiss cried out to Ruby. I said jump. Ruby shouted back. She's going to fall. Blake flatly said. She'll be fine. Ruby was pretty sure of that. She's falling. Ren added on. As Weiss began to plummet from the Nevermore, John finally regained his stamina and could contribute to the conversation. Hey guys, what I miss? John. Ruby called out. Weiss is falling. You have to save her too. Wah. Oh no. John saw Weiss's falling form and extended his hand once again. Alright, he thought, just gotta slow her down. Slow down. John continued on the train of thought to no avail. John. Ruby asked concerned as her partner was still plummeting. I don't know how I did that before. John came to the horrifying realization. I kinda just did it to save you. I don't know how to do it on command. Ruby's eyes went wide, but Pyrrha was the one to step in front of him first. John. You need to focus. What were thinking when you saved Ruby? Hurry. She commanded, giving a quick help session on his supposed semblance. I was afraid. I was scared that Ruby was going to get hurt. John said as he locked eyes with Pyrrha. Ruby, for her part, blushed a bit and rubbed the back of her head. Oh well, I'm sure I would have been fine. Focus John. Pyrrha called out again. Think back on that fear. Remember that feeling, and use it. You're the only one that can save her. That was a bit of a lie on Pyrrha's part. She could probably slow Weiss down by pulling on her rapier, or Weiss could also use her glyphs, but this was too perfect an opportunity for John to gain more control of his semblance. Right, okay. Remember the fear. John thought back on how terrified he was when he saw Ruby falling. How terrified he was when he was falling. The fear that drove him forward, that kept him from dying, that drove him to protect his friend. He didn't want to see Weiss get hurt. He will save her. And with that surge of emotion, Weiss felt an invisible grasp coil around her, slowly bringing her down to the ground. Gently, John placed Weiss on the ground on her knees, and he gave her smile behind his sweaty, exhausted expression. Just dropping in, he flirted, before promptly collapsing on the ground from exhaustion. Weiss had to admit, she was not dissatisfied with her rescue. John. Pyrrha called out as she moved to help him. Great. The gang's all here. Now we can die together. Yang cried out, exasperated by the whole situation. Ruby, taking a look at the incapacitated John, who saved her and her partner, felt the resolve within her strengthen. Not if I can help it. Ruby let out a mighty battle cry and charged for the Deathstalker. RWBY, wait. Yang called out, but unfortunately, RWBY's speed was her strong suit. To John's horror, he watched as RWBY was tossed about like sandbag by the Deathstalker, easily overpowering her. He watched as Yang tried to make her way to save her sister, only to be blocked off by a series of feathers from the Nevermore, which also pinned RWBY's cape. John wanted to run there and help. To save his new friend, but his body wouldn't listen to him. He was far too exhausted from using his supposed semblance. He could hear Yang call out for RWBY again as the Deathstalker made its way over to her, ready to bring down its stinger on her. Anger welled up inside of John. Anger and hate. Towards himself for being too weak, towards RWBY for rushing in like an idiot, towards the Grimm for simply existing. John felt the anger build up inside of him, ready to explode. If that stupid scorpion did anything to RWBY, he was going to rend it from existence. But before the anger could erupt out of him, RWBY was saved by a white blur as Weiss dashed forward to save her partner, encasing the Deathstalker's stinger in ice. Oh, thank the brothers. John muttered as the anger and adrenaline left his system, physically deflating him. RWBY and Weiss seemed to talk for a bit and come to an understanding, despite still being within striking distance of the Deathstalker. When they returned, Yang gave her sister a big hug, which was interrupted by the Nevermore's roar. Guys, that thing's circling back. What are we going to do? John asked as his energy returned to him. He was starting to understand his semblance now. It seemed to run off a different well of energy than his aura. He could use his telekinesis for some crazy stuff, but too much use, and it would physically exhaust him for a few moments, before it would replenish itself relatively quickly. Weiss was the first to respond. Look, there's no sense dilly-dallying. Our objective is right in front of us, she said, motioning to the relics. She's right. Our mission is to grab an artifact and make it back to the cliffs. RWBY agreed, nodding at Weiss. There's no point in fighting these things. Run and live, that's an idea I can get behind. John may have superpowers now, but he needed to figure out their limits. Preferably in a gym, with a nurse on standby. Not in a deathmatch against two probably ancient Grimm. John ran for the ruins, grabbed the golden rook, and took off with the rest of his companions. The 8 teenagers continued to run for the cliffs, reaching an abandoned series of ruins built over a deep gorge. The Nevermore was still on their tail, so they chose to conceal themselves behind some of the stone blocks as the Nevermore perched upon the ruins, blocking their path. Well, that's great. Yang let out an annoyed grunt. John felt his sixth sense tingling, and turning his head, saw that the Deathstalker had caught up, bursting through the forest behind them. Ah, man, run! He called out. The group scattered, ditching their cover and running straight for the ruins. The Nevermore, now having regained line of sight on the students, rose up in the air and began its attack. Nora, distract it, Ren yelled. With a smile, Nora ran of cover, nimbly dodging the feathers launched towards her. Drawing Monhild from her back in grenade launcher form, she fired several pink 40mm grenades at the Nevermore, forcing it away. As she kept firing, the Deathstalker approached from behind, hoping to score an easy kill with the distracted Nora. However, before it could close the distance, Ren and Blake cut into its carapace with a simultaneous strike, stopping its advance. Just as quickly, Weiss landed next to Nora, and with a glyph enhancing her leap, jumped away with her. As the group made their way over the first bridge in the chasm, running towards a solitary tower, Pyrrha yelled at them to go as she turned around and fired several rounds at the Deathstalker, slowing it down enough for Ren and Blake to make their escape. As they were crossing, the Nevermore began its next run. Swooping down, the Nevermore crashed straight into the bridge that the teens were running on, bisecting it, forcing Yang, RWBY, Nora, Weiss, and John on one side, and Pyrrha, Blake, and Ren on the other. John stood up and saw that Pyrrha, Blake, and Ren were being pushed back by the Deathstalker. Man, we gotta get over there. They need help. Nora ran up beside, grenade launcher drawn. Let's do this. John looked down over the edge of the broken bridge. His immediate thought was something along the lines of, there's no way he can make that jump. But then John let out calming breath, focus, like Pyrrha said. He thought. Then he remembered. The dream. He had forgotten about it in the chaos of the initiation, but in his dream, he saw both Alec and the dreadlocked man make leaps like this look easy. Looking down into the chasm, he felt the fear of falling grip his heart once again. Use it. Feel the fear, let it drive you forward. He mentally yelled at himself. John? Nora asked, confused as the knight seemingly froze in place. Drawing Crocea Morse, John's countenance hardened. Seeing his friends fighting, he thought to himself, I won't let them get hurt. I will protect them. Let's go. John cried out as he ran straight for the broken gap, surrounding himself in his invisible force once more, and easily making the leap from bridge to bridge. Nora gave a devilish smile at John's fearless attitude. Not wanting to be outdone, she mecha shifted her weapon into its hammer form, stepped on its head, and fired a grenade that launched her towards the battle. The velocity of the explosion allowed Nora to reach the Deathstalker first, coming in with a flipping hammer strike right down on the Deathstalker's skull. The Grimm seemed to shrug the blow off, and aimed for a piercing counterattack. To avoid it, Nora fired another grenade, blasting her backwards, and accidentally into Blake, knocking her off the bridge. John bit back a curse, and peered over the edge to look for his friend. Luckily, Blake was able to grab hold of the ruins with her weapon and swung her way back up to the others. As they battled the Nevermore, he, Pyrrha, Nora, and Ren all faced down with the Deathstalker. The Deathstalker, seeing that they were all on a precariously supported bridge, stabbed its stinger into the ruins, causing it to collapse. Move. John called out as the four ran forward, rushing the Grimm. The Deathstalker threw a heavy claw at Pyrrha, but she deflected the attack with her shield, and hitting it back with a spinning backwards slash. It moved to strike with its other claw, but John jumped and parried the strike with his sword, giving Pyrrha the opportunity to leap over him and land another strike. The Deathstalker then attempted to spear him once again with its stinger, but John sensed its intentions. As the stinger moved in, John leapt in the air with a beautiful butterfly twist, flowing like water over the attack as it whipped. John decided to continue to push forward. As Ren let loose a volley of shots that pounded the Deathstalker's face, John ran underneath it. Instinctively using the technique he saw the dreadlocked figure do, John held Crocea Morse low, and let loose a series of rapid-fire cuts and thrusts, aimed for the Deathstalker's joints. Each cut drew black blood, and while he couldn't cut off a limb, he did wound it, significantly reducing its mobility. As he ran past the rear of the Scorpion, John looked up and saw Ren get tossed backwards by the Grimm, slamming him onto a stone pillar. John frowned as he realized he wasn't able to do enough damage to the Grimm. He looked down as his weapons. His shield. His shield was slowing him down. The size and weight of it felt too awkward in his hands, and it was throwing him off. Not only that, but using his shield prevented him from using both hands on his blade to strengthen his attacks. So, John deactivated his shield, placing it on his belt, and gripped Crocea Morse with both hands, sword raised high above his head. As Nora pummeled the Grimm with grenades, Pyrrha spun and threw Milo, slipping right through its claws and into one of its eyes. That was all the distraction John needed as he looked up and saw that Ren was able to wound the stinger with his pistols. With another telekinetic leap, John gracefully twirled through the air, almost hovering by the damaged stinger as he then unleashed a vicious spinning attack, severing the appendage. As he fell, John used his semblance to guide the stinger down into the carapace of the Deathstalker, impaling itself in the head. John landed with a roll and called out to Nora. Nora, nail it. Heads up. Nora cried out as she jumped on Akoo, the combined force of Pyrrha's leap and Nora's grenade sending her soaring into the air. Like a witch, Nora rode her hammer with a bright smile before twirling and slamming her hammer down onto the stinger, driving it through the Deathstalker's head and destroying the bridge. John watched with satisfaction as the Deathstalker fell into the canyon as his allies all gathered around him. It was only in the moment of momentary peace that John was able to ask himself one important question. How the dust did I just do all of that? While John had a relieved smile on his face from the victory, he couldn't help but scream on the inside. Again, too many questions were running through his mind. His father barely gave him any sword training, let alone gymnastics training. He should not have been able to do anything he just did. No. The moves he used were all based on the dreadlocked man's moves from his dream, that much he could tell. But that only raises further questions. Who is that man? How is he able to copy his techniques? What the Grimm is done to him? Look! Nora yelled, breaking John out of his internal musings. Snapping out of his stupor, John watched as Ruby had caught the Nevermore's neck with her scythe, and was running up Weiss's glyphs up the side of the cliff, firing her rifle for added speed. With one final shot, Ruby burst upward, decapitating the Grimm, and landing on top of the cliffs. Wow, was all John could say, as he and his friends watched the execution in amazement. Russell Thrush, Cardin Winchester, Dove Bronzewing, Sky Lark. The four of you retrieved the Black Bishop pieces. From this day forward, you will work together as Team CRDL, led by Cardin Winchester. Professor Ozpin announced. Applause could be heard as the four armored students walked off the stage as four new students replaced them. Pyrrha, Nora, Ren, and John stepped forward as their faces appeared on the screen. John Arc, Lai Ren, Pyrrha Nikos, Nora Valkyrie. The four of you retrieved the white rook pieces. From this day forward, you will work together as Team JNPR. Ozpin declared as Nora gave Ren a big hug. Led by John Arc. Led by, was all John could sputter out. Ozpin nodded. Congratulations, young man. Pyrrha walked up to him grinning, and gave him friendly love tap on the shoulder, which easily knocked down the exhausted knight. Afterwards, Ruby and Co were brought to the stage for their team naming. And finally, Blake Belladonna, Ruby Rose, Weiss Schnee, Yang Xiaolong. The four of you retrieved the White Knight pieces. From this day forward, you will work together as Team RWBY. Led by Ruby Rose. Both Ruby and Weiss were in shock while Yang ran over to hug her sister. John smiled. That was a position he thought she easily deserved. And so, surrounded by thunderous applause, the newly formed teams RWBY and JNPR finished their first steps on their journey to become huntsmen. Chapter 3. Victory. It's been 1 week since John started his new life at Beacon Academy. And other than a small spat between Ruby and Weiss on their team, things were going great. Sure, classes were pretty fast-paced and sometimes weird, but he could kinda keep up and was at least passing, which was good enough for him. But most importantly, his team was great. Ren was quiet and always tired, but easy to get along with, and always willing to give some sage advice when needed. Nora was. Well, Nora, but she never meant any harm with her eccentricities, and John was just glad to have her on his side. And Pyrrha was the best. Not only was she super awesome at pretty much everything she did, but she wasn't stuck up about it. Plus, she's always more than happy to help out, whether it's John with his homework or that one time Nora got stuck in a vending machine. The first night together was a bit awkward, but they got over it soon enough. The room itself was nice, albeit a bit Spartan. It was a single room with not too much decor, and 4 beds lined up side by side. The beds took up a lot of space, but luckily all 4 of them had opted to bring the bare essentials only, each only having enough to fill up a single backpack and maybe a suitcase or 2. Had they all brought more luggage, they might have had to resort to something more drastic, like bunk beds. The worst part was arranging who was sleeping where. John, like any sane person would, suggested that the boys stay on one side and the girls on the other, maybe even throw in a privacy curtain just in case. But Nora would not have it. Nora would not sleep anywhere not next to Ren, whom John just learned was her childhood friend. So instead, he and Pyrrha took the left side of the room while Ren and Nora took the right. That resulted in a sleepless night or 2 for John, who despite his newfound powers, skills, and leadership potential, was still a hormonal teenage boy with an overactive imagination. But such problems faded with time as the newly minted team JNPR quickly fell into the routine. And the icing on top of the cake was that when he finally did sleep, he wasn't having any more of those strange dreams. In his spare time, John would sometimes go to the library to research the names Alec, Dantuan, and Revan, but he found absolutely nothing, making him think it was probably just a one-off dream caused by the stress of initiation or something. So, he was more than happy to put that weird dream, vision, thing behind him and focus on enjoying his time here at Beacon. That night John had a vision. Once again, John went to sleep snug in his bed, ignoring the snoring of Nora from across the room. And once again, John woke up in a strange, alien landscape, with no knowledge of where he was. Waking up, John found himself lying on a field, but not a lush, amber-green field of tall grass. He was instead surrounded by miles of mud, worn down and well-traveled by what looked like thousands of footsteps. Rain constantly downpoured around him, which to his annoyance, he could feel even though it was a dream. "Aw shit, here we go again," John thought to himself as he awoke. Soaking wet and covered in grime, he lifted himself out of the mud, and took the time to observe his surroundings. While the natural terrain was nearly all muddy flatland, it was the man-made structures that stole his attention. On the horizon, he could see a city. But it wasn't like Vale or Mistral, or any other place he'd seen images of. Instead of modern concrete, brick, or drywall buildings with glass windows and street lights, there were massive stone structures, towers and pyramids that looked more like ancient ruins from those archaeologist Indigo Jones films he was a fan of. That's when behind him, he heard a familiar PSSSH of a laser sword activating. Turning around he was greeted with the familiar sight of the dreadlocked man. He looked different. His robes were changed from brown to black, his previously calm, peaceful demeanor was replaced with one contempt and disgust. And he was not alone either. Around him were a dozen other robed warriors, each with their own, glowing laser sword of blue, green, or yellow. Majority of them were human, but among them were a few. Faunus. The first was a female. Squid Faunus. She was an attractive, athletic woman, with blue skin, and instead of hair, had two long tentacles that started on the crown of her head and draped down her shoulders. Did Squid Faunus have blue skin? Was it racist of him to not know that? The second, John guessed, was some kind of male bull faunus. He had sandy, tan skin, and instead of two large horns, he had several short, stubby horns protruding from his forehead. Behind the group of laser sword warriors, were hundreds of soldiers in orange and black armor, wielding a variety of firearms, all with grim, hateful expressions. The dreadlocked warrior stood at the front of the group, and raised his laser sword high. "For the Republic! For Revan!" he cried as he and the others charged forward. John immediately spun and ran perpendicular to the army, hoping to get out of their way and avoid being trampled. But his retreat was cut off by a rocket explosion. John looked at where the rocket originated from, giving him a good view of the opposing army. Charging them were an army of warriors wearing full suits of battle armor with, what John thought was really cool looking helmets with T-shaped visors. "For Mandalore! For glory!" these warriors cried as they advanced. Their armors were of various colors, red, blue, yellow, and other combinations as they both ran and flew with jetpacks towards their opponents. Rockets and red laser bolts flew between the two armies, and fighters immediately started dropping like flies. John shoved the excitement of seeing laser guns and jetpacks down as he ran between the colliding forces. Diving on the ground, he watched in awe as the dreadlocked figure danced and weaved through the armored enemies. With savage precision the man cut through the armored warriors, leaving a path of blood and limbs in his wake. Suddenly 3 armored figures landed in front of him, intent on stopping his rampage. Raising their laser rifles at him they depressed their triggers and unleashed all they had on the dreadlocked figure. But it was to no avail as the figure began to twirl his own laser sword, and with inhuman accuracy reflected the laser bolts back at the attackers. As the lasers deflected off of their armor, the dreadlocked figure then extended his offhand. Like in the previous vision, the man launched an invisible, telekinetic wave from his hand, slamming into 2 of the armored soldiers and knocking them down. The dreadlocked figure then clenched his fist and dragged it to him, gripping the 3rd warrior and similarly pulling him in front of him. The armored warrior was completely in the grasp of the dreadlocked man, flailing as he was suspended in the air. That's when John felt it. He felt everything. He felt the fear pouring off the armored warrior. It was intoxicating. He knew the dreadlocked warrior felt it too, as all he radiated joy and excitement, drawing some kind of sick satisfaction as the warrior of Mandalore was powerless to resist. With a single flick of the laser sword, the dreadlocked man decapitated the armored warrior, the single slash slicing through a chink in the armor located at the neck. The two who were on the ground were still stunned and disoriented, struggling to get up, when they too began floating in the air. They were raised several feet before accelerating downwards, reaching an insane speed as they impacted the ground. John could hear the crunch of bones as they impacted the ground, but their armor prevented the attack from killing them outright. But the dreadlocked man did not give any respite, for as soon as they hit the ground once again, he strode forward, and with a cut of his blade felled both prone warriors with ease. Though the dreadlocked man didn't know if they should even be called warriors after such a pathetic showing. The dreadlocked figure charged forward once again, hacking and slashing his way through the mob without mercy or hesitation. Such ideas were meaningless, they didn't deserve either. Dashing in front of another armored warrior, a swift upward slash immediately cut off the warrior's arms. The crippled warrior fell to her knees, her body entering shock as the dreadlocked man aimed his sword at her throat, ready to execute. Suddenly the dreadlocked man felt a searing pain in his back as a laser bolt slammed into it, sending him stumbling forward. A new armored warrior moved to aid his comrade as the dreadlocked man seemed not to move. As the new warrior bent down to lift his companion up, he froze, his body shaking and unable to move. The warrior slowly brought his hands to his throat as he was unable to take in any air. John turned back to the dreadlocked man, rising from the mud snarling, his hand raised, miming a crushing motion as he force-choked the armored figure. With a gasp and a gurgle, it only took a few seconds before the warrior fell to the ground, dead at the deadlocked figure's feet. The new warrior dead at his feet, John watched in horror as the dreadlocked figure didn't even take a second to execute the wounded female warrior, who was still stunned on her knees. Surrounded by the dead, with the battle still raging around him, the dreadlocked figure raised his laser sword into the air, and gave a shrill, soul-shattering war cry. To the outside observer, it would look like as if the dreadlocked man was trying to rally his forces. But John could feel the man's emotions, his motives. The man was enjoying himself, reveling in the wholesale slaughter. And the sadistic pleasure of the man only served to make him stronger. John could feel the dreadlocked figure's power, it bled from him, echoing across the battlefield and it terrified John. John, wake up! Kira shouted as she shook him awake. Wah wah ah! John cried out as he was so startled he fell right out of his bed and onto the ground. Ow! What? Kira, what's going on? Why are you shaking me like that? What? Kira asked, genuinely confused. John, you were thrashing in your sleep. Pretty violently as well, so I thought it was best to wake you up. Are you okay? John shook his head to clear the morning sluggishness out of his mind. Yeah, no, I'm good, I think. Sorry if I worried you guys, I was just having a really weird dream. Seemed more like a nightmare from the way you moving. Nora chimed in from the bathroom, in the middle of brushing her teeth. Right, well, sorry anyway. Must have been something I ate last night. John weakly lied as he then checked his scroll for the time. It was 8:45 a.m., and oh my dust, why couldn't you have woken me up sooner? Our first class is at 9. John shot up and ripped his pants off as he moved to get ready for class. We were trying to earlier, but you wouldn't get up. Kira countered as she turned away from the pantless John, slightly red. Anyway, hurry up and get changed, we don't want to be late for Professor Goodwich's class. Combat class. In another time, in another universe, John Ark would have dreaded attending combat class, where his lack of training would have made him a bottom-of-the-barrel laughing stock. But right here, right now, John Ark was dominating. Standing on his side of the arena, Crocea Morse held in one hand, John stared his opponent, a heaving and tired Cardin Winchester, down with a smug grin on his face. While a part of him felt a little bad for making an absolute mockery of the Winchester boy, a larger, much more vocal part of him was having far too much fun. Go John! John could hear Pyrrha and Ruby call out from the auditorium seats, waving small, Team JNPR flags handmade by Blake. Yeah, fearless leader, break his legs. Nora bellowed over everyone else, cackling maniacally. Cardin grit his teeth at his situation, and charged at John, swinging his mace down with a mighty blow. John didn't even have to fully block it, instead simply parrying it to the side, redirecting the attack while he spun around behind Cardin, hitting him with a cut to the back. Roaring, Cardin went for a swinging backfist, desperate to break John's nose. John bent over backwards, easily dodging the attack, before gaining more distance with a one-handed back handspring. As Cardin fully rotated to face his opponent, John dashed forward faster than he could react. Crocea Morse connected on Cardin's stomach, knocking the wind out of him and taking a good chunk of his aura. Snarling, Cardin swung his mace once again, this time in a wide horizontal swing visible from a mile away. John simply leapt over the attack, over Cardin, adding in a flip for style, and landed directly behind him. Let's see if I can do this correctly, John thought to himself as his focus skyrocketed. Thinking back to the dreadlocked man in the dream, John focused his semblance into his hand, opening his palm. Extending his offhand forward, Cardin was instantly knocked 5 feet backwards by the John's invisible telekinetic abilities, ungracefully falling to the ground. Yes, I did it, John congratulated himself, taking his eyes off Cardin and looking at his now clenched fist with joy. While Cardin was an ungraceful lout, he was still a huntsman in training, and could recognize opportunity when it presented itself. Swiftly standing while John was still distracted, Cardin raised his mace high and smashed it to the ground, pulling the trigger of the weapon, activating its red dust crystal and sending a series of explosions towards John. John was so absorbed in his accomplishment that he didn't see the attack until it was too late. The explosion knocked him back, shredding his aura, and sending him to the ground in return. An exhausted Cardin slowly sauntered up to the prone John, raising his mace up high once again. This is the part where you lose, Winchester smugly spoke as he prepared the finishing blow. That single comment ignited a fire and rage inside of John that he never knew existed. How dare he? How dare this worm think he is strong enough to defeat him? He is nothing. He is insignificant. John was going to show him what it means to lose. As Cardin was about to bring his mace down, John extended his hand once again, but this time instead of an open palm, he was making a cupping gesture with his fingers. A second passed as neither fighter moved from their stance. Everyone in the crowd was confused as Cardin seemingly stopped his attack for no reason. The confusing was only amplified when Cardin's mace fell out of his hands and he brought said hands to his throat. Cardin backpedaled a few staggered steps, tears starting to form at the corners of his eyes. Glinda Goodwitch, the professor in charge of the combat class, was initially just as confused as the rest of the class. But her keen, analytical eyes honed over a career as a huntress saw what most her students failed to see. The flesh around Cardin's neck moved, compressing as if it were being constricted by an invisible force. Her eyes then flashed to John, whose hand was perfectly shaped to mime strangling a helpless victim. That, combined with his telekinetic semblance, it did not take her long to put 2 and 2 together. Mr. Ark, that's enough. Release him, Professor Goodwitch shouted, causing several students to flinch with her sudden outburst. Several students looked to each other, confused as to what was going on. Meanwhile, John did hear her, but didn't care enough to stop. He didn't need to stop. What he needed to do was crush this weakling, this worm, beneath his boot. John was so focused on crushing Cardin that he did not notice as his body began to glow with a purple aura. In an instant, Glinda had wrapped John up with her own semblance, and flung him out of the ring, hard. With a resounding smash, John flew over the other students, slamming into the marble walls of Beacon, the impact sending spiderweb fractures throughout the wall. John's aura shattered immediately, and his concentration on the force choke, broken. Everyone was stunned into silence at what just happened. No words were traded, only confused and concerned glances between the students. The only noise in the room was that of Cardin Winchester, on his knees, wheezing, as John laid on the ground next to the wall, unmoving.